The air on Scorvia's surface was saturated with dust and chemicals, a noxious mix that stuck to my skin and burned my lungs with every breath. But it didn't kill me. Not anymore. Not since they'd altered me, changed my DNA to suit the needs of an empire that had long forgotten what it meant to care for those who toiled beneath its floating palaces. I was one of the children of the earth, a term spat with venom by those who lived above, in their pristine cities suspended in the clouds. To them, we were less than human, a necessary evil to extract the riches from this world while they basked in their genetically engineered perfection. Up there, disease was a relic of the past, and death was a distant memory, pushed further away by every new advancement. Down here, death was all too familiar, as common as the dust in the air. The fields spread out endlessly before me, a vast area of withered vegetation clinging to life in the poisoned soil. I worked alone today, my hands hardened and deformed, not from labor, but from the genetic modifications that allowed me to survive in this hellish environment. My skin had turned rough and cracked like the parched earth beneath my feet. I could withstand temperatures that would melt unmodified flesh, endure the toxins that would choke an unaltered man in seconds. But I paid for it in other ways. Pain that ate away at me, and memories that disturbed my dreams, memories of what I had been before they changed me into this. I hardly remembered my parents now. They had died in the mines when I was just a child, crushed beneath tons of rock in a collapse that the overseers had dismissed as inevitable. They were digging for core metals, the precious elements that fueled the Empire's insatiable hunger for more power, more control, more wealth. The mines were deep, too deep, and the earth had rebelled, swallowing my parents and dozens of others in a single, suffocating instant. I was left alone, a child with no future, destined to be discarded like so many others before me. But I didn't die. I survived, because I was different. Even back then, before I knew what they had done to me, I was stronger, faster, more resilient than the others. It was why they had kept me alive, sent me to the fields instead of the mines, and watched from a distance as I grew into something they didn't fully understand. I paused, standing in the shadow of one of the massive harvester machines that dotted the landscape. Its dull, iron shape towered over me, churning the earth with an endless, mechanical rhythm. I could feel the vibrations through my boots. The machine was an extension of the Empire, just like everything else on this planet. It was persistent, tireless, and utterly indifferent to the lives it ground beneath its treads. My hand curled into a fist as I stared at the harvester, my mind drifting to darker thoughts. There was power within me, power I didn't fully understand yet, but it was growing. I had felt it in recent months, a surge of energy whenever I let my anger get the best of me. I could feel it now, simmering just below the surface, a force that begged to be released. But I held it back. Not here, not now. There were eyes everywhere, drones that hovered high above, their lenses scanning for any sign of disobedience. The overseers didn't care if we died in the fields or the mines, but they would never tolerate insurrection. I had seen what happened to those who resisted. I had watched their bodies torn apart by imperial enforcers, their blood soaking into the earth that had given them life. My shift ended as the sun set, its weak light swallowed by the haze that shrouded this world. The fields were silent now, the harvester machines powered down, their work done for the day. I turned and made my way toward the bunkhouses, a series of low, squat structures that blended into the landscape, as unremarkable and bleak as everything else on the surface. I reached the bunkhouse and pushed open the door, the metal creaking on rusted hinges. The others were already asleep, their bodies strewn across thin mattresses, covered in tattered blankets that did little to ward off the chill. I found my corner, a small space I'd carved out for myself, and sat down on the edge of the mattress. For a moment I simply sat there, staring at the wall, my mind a tangle of thoughts and emotions, anger, frustration, and a burning desire for something more than this. I didn't know what that more was yet, but I knew it wasn't here. In the filth and the darkness. I lay down, pulling the blanket over me, and closed my eyes. I drifted into a slumber, my dreams filled with fire and blood and the faces of those I had lost. I woke to the sound of alarms. I was on my feet in an instant, the reflexes that had been bred into me kicking in without thought. The others were slower to react, groggy and disoriented, but I didn't wait for them. I knew what was coming. The doors to the bunkhouse burst open, and the enforcers stormed in, their black armor shining in the low light. They advanced cautiously, weapons ready, inspecting the room for any sign of resistance. There was none. We had all seen this before. The culling. I dropped to my knees, my hands behind my head, and stared at the floor. I could feel the power stirring within me again, a wild, uncontrolled force that surged through my veins. It was tempting, so tempting to let it loose, to tear these bastards apart with the power they had forced upon me. But I held back, forcing myself to stay still. The enforcers moved through the room, selecting their targets. They grabbed the weakest, the sickest, those whose mutations had gone too far, leaving them broken and useless. There was no mercy in their actions. They were doing their duty, nothing more. One of them stopped in front of me, his visor reflecting my image back at me, a malformed, grey-skinned creature that didn't much resemble a man. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something, then moved on without a word. I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my body. Not tonight. I had been spared, but not everyone was so lucky. I heard the sounds of struggle, of pleading, and then the sharp crack of a weapon being discharged. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and I fought the urge to gag. The enforcers dragged the bodies out, leaving the rest of us in silence. When they were gone, I stood slowly, my muscles trembling with suppressed rage. The others were too numb, too broken to care anymore, but I wasn't. Not yet. I still had fight left in me. And one day, I would make them pay for what they had done, for what they continued to do. One day, I would bring them down. All of them. The day began like any other, a march into the fields under the watchful eyes of the overseers and their drones. The toxic dust was thicker, swirling in eddies that stung my eyes. But we were expected to work, regardless of the conditions. The Empire had quotas, and those quotas didn't account for weather or worker fatigue. I took my place among the rows of mutated crops, each one an odd version of the plants they had once been. Their leaves were yellow, their stems bulging with tumors that dripped foul-smelling sap. They thrived in the poisoned soil, just as we were meant to thrive in this poisoned world. The harvester machines rumbled to life, their massive treads churning the earth as they rolled forward, cutting a path through the fields. I moved alongside one, my hands working mechanically, pulling the ripe growths from the plants and tossing them into the maw of the machine. The process was mind-numbing, an endless repetition that dulled the senses and deadened the mind. But today, something was different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that I could feel deep inside, though I didn't yet know why. It wasn't long before I found out. The sound of engines roared overhead, louder than the usual drone patrols. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun, and saw black, angular ships descending from the clouds, cutting through the sky like knives. They were larger than the typical enforcer craft, their bellies bristling with weapons and sensors. The ships hovered for a moment, and then the sides opened, disgorging dozens of enforcers who dropped to the ground. They spread out quickly, moving like a well-trained unit. Panic spread through the workers. Men and women scrambled to escape, dropping their tools and running in all directions. But there was nowhere to go. The enforcers were too fast, too well coordinated. They herded us together, pushing us back toward the center of the fields where the ground was more open, less chance for cover. The enforcers moved among us, scanning the crowd with their visors, selecting those who were too slow, too weak, too deformed to be of use. But instead of the usual summary executions, They began dragging them away back toward the waiting ships. The ones who resisted were beaten down, their cries silenced by the crack of electro-batons against bone. I observed one of them. He was taller than the others, his armor more elaborate, with red markings that identified him as an officer of the Biotech Consortium. He moved through the crowd, his helmeted head turning slowly as he surveyed the crowd. When his gaze fell on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. He was here for something specific, and a part of me feared that it might be me. He walked toward me, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. The other enforcers parted for him, their postures deferential. He stopped in front of me, his visor reflecting my face back at me. "You," he said, his voice cold and mechanical. "Stand." I could feel the power inside me, the same power I had felt last night, rising in response to the threat. But I forced it down, knowing that this wasn't the time to act. I stood slowly, keeping my focus on the officer, my muscles tensed, ready to move if I needed to. He circled me, his eyes assessing, as if he were evaluating a piece of machinery. "You are different," he said after a moment. "Stronger, faster, enhanced beyond the standard modifications." He stopped in front of me again. "You are a product of Project Titan, aren't you?" I had never heard that name before, but the way he said it sent a shiver through me. It sounded like a curse, or perhaps something worse, a fate. I didn't respond, but I could see from the way his posture stiffened that he had taken my silence as confirmation. "We've been looking for you," he continued. "You're not like the others. You're an anomaly, a mistake that was never meant to exist. But you are valuable. We can use you." I felt the anger rise again, hotter this time, more intense. They had made me into this, and now they wanted to use me? I was a tool to them, nothing more. The thought of it, the sheer arrogance, made my blood boil. But I couldn't act. There were too many of them, and I wasn't sure if I could control the power long enough to do anything but get myself killed. The officer must have seen something in my eyes because he took a step back and nodded to the enforcers. "Take him," he ordered. "Carefully, he's dangerous." They moved toward me, their hands outstretched, ready to subdue me. And that was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to be their pawn. Not now, not ever. The power flowed through me with even greater intensity, an elemental force that raced through my veins like a blazing fire. I didn't try to control it this time. I let it take over, let it guide my actions. The ground around me stirred, and the air sparked with energy. The enforcers stopped, sensing the change. With a single explosive motion, I released the power. The ground beneath us erupted, throwing the enforcers back, their bodies tumbling through the air like ragdolls. The officer staggered, trying to maintain his footing, but the shockwave knocked him to the ground. I didn't stop. The power was in control now, and it wanted destruction. I felt the earth move beneath me, felt the air around me churn as I pulled on the elements, bending them to my will. The harvester machines crumpled like paper, their massive forms collapsing under the force of the energy I was releasing. The officer scrambled to his feet, his visor cracked, blood running down his face. He tried to raise his weapon, but I was on him before he could pull the trigger. My hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground with a strength that wasn't my own. I could see the fear in his eyes, could feel his pulse quicken under my grip. "You wanted me," I growled. "Well, here I am." I slammed him into the ground, the force of the impact cracking the earth beneath him. His body went limp, his helmet shattered. I stood there breathing heavily, the power slowly receding, leaving me drained. The field around me was in ruins, the orderly rows of crops reduced to a smoking wasteland. The enforcers were either dead or fleeing, their disciplined ranks shattered by the fury I had released. I looked around at the devastation I had caused, at the bodies scattered across the ground, and I knew that there was no going back now. The Empire would come for me, and they wouldn't stop until they had me in chains or dead. but I wouldn't go down without a fight. Not anymore. I turned and walked away from the destruction, my mind already spinning with thoughts of what I needed to do next. I traveled through the uninhabited areas, keeping to the shadows and steering clear of the patrols that scoured the fields and settlements for any sign of me. The power that had saved me in the fields had also marked me as a target. The Empire knew what I was, and they would stop at nothing to capture or kill me. But I wouldn't make it easy for them. I traveled by night, the toxic winds carrying the scent of death. The nights were colder now, the temperature dropping to levels that would have been lethal to an unmodified human. But to me, it was just another challenge to overcome. My body had been engineered to withstand the worst this planet could throw at me, and I was beginning to understand just how much more I was capable of. I followed the old trade routes, long abandoned by the surface dwellers, who had either died or been relocated to the more industrialized zones. These paths were little more than cracks in the earth, narrow and treacherous, but they offered cover from the aerial patrols. It was on one of these routes that I stumbled upon the entrance to the hideout. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a collapsed section of a mine, the rocks piled high and the opening barely visible. But as I approached, I noticed the telltale signs of human activity, scuff marks in the dirt, and the distant sound of a generator. I took a moment to think about the possible trap, but the need for a safe place and answers was stronger. I pushed aside the loose rocks, revealing a narrow tunnel that led deep into the earth. Further ahead, the tunnel opened into a large space, lit by lamps hanging from the ceiling. The space was cluttered with machinery, old and rusted but still functional. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in tools and equipment that I couldn't even begin to identify. In the center of the room was a large console, its screens displaying streams of data that scrolled by too quickly to read. But it was the far wall that caught my attention. There, carved into the rock, was a symbol, a spiral of intertwined DNA strands, the mark of the Biotech Consortium. Beneath it, written by hand, were the words, "We are not their property." The sight of that symbol stirred something within me, a vague memory of my childhood, of conversations between my parents about the work they did in the mines, and the fear in their eyes when they spoke of the consortium. I approached the wall, running my fingers over the rough surface, the words carved into the stone like a scar. A soft beep drew my attention back to the console, its screen now displaying a single word: access. The machine was old, from a time before the Empire's complete domination, but it still worked. I reached out and pressed the blinking key. A new stream of data appeared. Files, hundreds of them, each one labeled with a code I couldn't decipher. I scrolled through them, searching for anything that might give me a clue as to what this place was, or why it had been abandoned. One file caught my eye. It was marked Project Titan, the same name the officer had spoken right before he met his end. I selected the file, and the screen was filled with pages of text, diagrams, and images. Project Titan had been an experiment in genetic modification, an attempt by the Biotech Consortium to create a new breed of human, one that could survive in the harshest conditions and perform tasks that were beyond the capabilities of normal workers. The project had been a failure, at least according to the reports, with most of the subjects dying during the initial trials. But a few had survived. Mutations, they were called, aberrations that were too dangerous to be allowed to live. The project was shut down, and the surviving subjects were dispersed, hidden among the general population to avoid drawing attention. I was one of those subjects. They had made me, engineered me to be something more than human, but less than perfect. A prototype, a mistake, and now they wanted to eliminate me because I was a threat to their carefully controlled world. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated the power they had given me. I wasn't going to be their tool, their weapon. I was going to be their undoing. I backed away from the console. The files had given me the answers I sought, but they had also opened up a world of new questions. How many others were there like me? What had happened to them? How could I stop the consortium? I had power, and I had nothing left to lose. But first, I needed to understand that power. This place was isolated, far from the nearest settlement, and hidden from the aerial patrols that hunted me. It was the perfect place to begin testing the limits of what I could do. I knew it was dangerous. Every time I had used the power, it had taken more out of me, left me weaker, more unstable. But if I was going to survive, if I was going to fight back, I needed to master it. I began with the earth. The ground here was hard and dry, cracked and barren, the result of years of over-extraction and pollution. I crouched down, placing my hands on the surface, feeling the texture of the dirt and rocks beneath my fingers. I closed my eyes, focusing on the energy within me, the force that I could feel coursing just beneath the surface of my skin. The power was there, but it was slippery, like trying to grasp water with my hands. I forced myself to relax, to let go of my fear and frustration. I had done this before, in moments of desperation or anger. Now I needed to do it consciously. I breathed in, slow and deep, letting the air fill my lungs, then exhaled, pushing the breath out through my nose. As I did, I imagined the energy flowing out of me, into the earth, spreading out like roots into the ground. The sensation was strange, as if the earth was responding to me. I felt a shift, a tremor beneath my hands. The ground began to move, the cracks widening, the rocks grinding against each other. It was weak at first, a gentle vibration, but it amplified with each passing second until the entire cavern was shaking. I opened my eyes and saw the ground buckling, the rocks rising and falling as if they were alive. I could feel the energy coursing through me, wild and powerful, begging to be released. But I held it back, trying to control it, to focus it. The strain was immense. My muscles hurt, my head pounded, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. The power was too much, too intense, and it was tearing me apart from the inside. But I had to keep going. I had to master it. I clenched my fists, digging my fingers into the earth, and pushed harder, forcing the energy to obey my will. The ground erupted, spires of rock shooting up from the floor, piercing the air like the teeth of some massive beast. The force of it knocked me back, sending me crashing to the ground, struggling to breathe. For a moment, I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, my chest heaving. The power had receded, leaving me drained, my muscles twitching with exhaustion. But I had done it. I had controlled it, at least for a moment. I rolled onto my side, wincing at the pain that shot through my body, and pushed myself to my feet. The place was transformed. The flat ground was now a jagged landscape of stone and rock. I had done this. I had shaped the earth with my will alone. I stumbled over to one of the walls and leaned against it, trying to steady myself. The power was dangerous. It was a weapon, one that could just as easily destroy me as it could my enemies. I had to learn to control it, to use it without letting it consume me. For the next few days, I practiced, pushing myself to the limit. I focused on different aspects of the power, trying to understand its nuances, its limitations. I worked with the earth, learning to move it, shape it, even create small tremors that I could direct at will. I experimented with the air, calling the toxic winds to swirl around me, forming a protective barrier that could deflect objects and even cut through stone. But every time I used the power, it took something from me. My skin began to crack, deep fissures forming along my arms and legs, oozing blood and something darker, something unnatural. I was changing, just as the Empire had designed. The power was altering me, inside and out, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. On the last day, I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. I stood with my arms outstretched, my eyes closed, and called on the full extent of the power. The earth shook violently, the air swirling around me in a vortex of dust and rubble. The walls groaned under the strain, cracks forming along the ceiling as the entire structure began to collapse. But I didn't stop. I poured everything I had into the power, letting it consume me, take me to the brink of oblivion. I felt the energy tearing at my flesh, burning through my veins like acid. My vision went white, the pain unbearable, but I didn't let go. And then, just as I thought I would lose control, something clicked. The power snapped into focus, the wild, chaotic energy suddenly sharp, precise. I could see it now, every thread, every strand of energy that flowed through me, through the earth, through the air. It was all connected, all part of the same web, and I was at the center. I opened my eyes and the place was still. The walls had stopped shaking, the air was calm, and the earth beneath my feet was solid. The power was mine, completely and utterly under my control. I had done it. I had mastered the power. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to move to start the fight that I had been born for. I left the hideout behind, the entrance sealing itself with a thought, the rocks shifting back into place as if it had never been there. The wind whipped around me, carrying the scent of sulfur. My destination was clear. The agricultural facility just beyond the ridge, a key supplier of the bioengineered crops that sustained the floating cities above. It was a symbol of the Empire's control, and tonight it would burn. The journey across the landscape was swift and silent. The night cloaked my movements, the stars above dim and distant, almost invisible through the haze of pollution. I moved like a shadow, the toxic winds swirling at my back, pushing me forward. The facility was visible from afar, its domes and spires bathed in harsh, artificial lights. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for a city, but I knew better. It was a factory, a place where life was perverted to serve the Empire's needs. As I approached, the ground beneath my feet became smoother, the jagged rocks giving way to the paved roads that led to the facility's gates. The security was tight. Drones hovered above, their sensors sweeping the perimeter, while armored guards patrolled in measured steps. These guards were not the usual overseers. They were soldiers, genetically enhanced like me, their bodies engineered for strength and endurance. I could see it in their movements, the way they carried themselves with an air of superiority, confident in their power. But they didn't know what they were up against. Not yet. I crouched behind a cluster of boulders, observing the patterns of the patrols, the timing of the drone sweeps. I had spent days watching them, learning their routines, their weaknesses. I knew exactly when to strike. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, mixing with the power that simmered just beneath the surface. I took a deep breath, calming myself, focusing. This wasn't just an act of sabotage. It was a message. I waited until the nearest patrol turned the corner, their backs to me, then moved swiftly. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the earth bending to my will, and I was inside the perimeter before the drones could register my presence. The first guard didn't even see me coming. A quick twist of my wrist and the air around him solidified, choking off his breath, silencing him before he could raise the alarm. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless, and I moved on. The facility's main entrance was heavily fortified, but I wasn't going through the front door. I slipped around the side, where the ventilation systems produced a steady, regular vibration. The vents were large, designed to expel the toxic byproducts of the bioengineering processes within. I placed my hands on the metal, feeling the vibrations, the energy coursing through the facility. With a thought, the metal groaned, creating an opening just large enough for me to slip through. Inside, machines operated, producing the crops that fed the elites above. I moved quickly, planting explosive charges at key points throughout the facility. Power conduits, storage tanks, processing units. Each charge was set with a precise timer, synchronized to create a chain reaction that would reduce the facility to rubble. As I planted the final charge, something caught my attention. An unusual sound, distinct from the constant drone of the machines. It was coming from a corridor deeper within the facility, a place that wasn't on the schematics I had studied. Curiosity tugged at me. And despite the risks, I followed the sound. The corridor led to a large, reinforced door, sealed tight with multiple locks and security systems. This was no ordinary storage room. I placed my hand on the door, feeling the vibrations of the machinery behind it. With a concentrated effort, I sent a pulse of energy through the metal, short-circuiting the locks. Inside, the room was filled with rows of glass tanks, each one containing a human figure suspended in a thick, greenish liquid. Their eyes were closed, their bodies limp, but I could see the rise and fall of their chests. They were alive, but in some kind of stasis. Wires and tubes connected their bodies to the machines that lined the walls, monitoring their vital signs, feeding them nutrients, keeping them alive but unconscious. These weren't ordinary people. Their bodies were altered in ways that were all too familiar. Thickened skin, enhanced musculature. These were experiments, just like me. But they weren't finished. They were in the process of being remade, reshaped into something new. I moved from tank to tank. There were dozens of them, all in various stages of transformation. Some resembled humans to a degree, their features still recognizable, while others were hardly more than shapes, their forms unsettling and foreign. I recognized the signs, the same mutations, the same alterations that I had seen in myself. These were the next generation of the Empire's experiments, the next wave of Project Titan. And then I saw the console at the far end of the room, its screen flashing with lines of data. I approached it, activating the terminal. The screen lit up, displaying a series of files, each one labeled with a code that I recognized immediately. These were the continuation of Project Titan, the plans that the Biotech Consortium had been working on in secret. I scrolled through the files, my eyes widening as the full scope of their plan became clear. They were creating a new breed of human, one that would surpass even the elites in the floating cities. These weren't just workers, they were designed to be leaders, soldiers, rulers. The Consortium wasn't just content with controlling the Empire from the shadows, they wanted to rule it outright. And they were using the rebellion, using me to destabilize the current regime and pave the way for their new order. I staggered back from the console. I had been manipulated from the start. My rebellion, it was all part of their plan. They had created me to be the catalyst, the spark that would ignite the flames of revolution, and in doing so, clear the way for their rise to power. I felt the anger rise within me, hotter and more intense than ever before. They had played me, used me as a tool in their game. I turned away from the console. I had to finish what I started. The charges were set, and the timers were ticking down. The facility would be destroyed, and with it, the next generation of the Empire's experiments. But I knew now that this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come, and it wouldn't be against the Empire alone. The Biotech Consortium had to be stopped, their plans exposed, their power dismantled. I sprinted out of the room, the door sealing itself behind me. The facility's alarms went off, the guards and drones scrambling to respond to the impending threat. But it was too late. I moved through the corridors like a phantom, evading the security forces, making my way to the exit. As I emerged into the night, the first of the charges detonated, a massive explosion ripping through the facility. The ground shook beneath me, the shockwave throwing me off my feet, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself up and kept running, the facility collapsing in on itself behind me, the flames licking at the sky, a sight of devastation that could be seen for miles. I reached the ridge and turned to watch as the facility crumbled, the explosions continuing in a chain reaction that consumed everything in its path. The fire reflected in my eyes, a symbol of the devastation I had brought about, but also of the conviction that now burned within me. The rebellion had started, but it wasn't the rebellion the Biotech Consortium had planned for. I wasn't going to be their tool. I was going to destroy them, expose their lies and free my people from the chains they had forged around us. But to do that, I had to reach the heart of their power. The floating city of Stratos, where the consortium's leaders hid behind walls of privilege and luxury, was my next target. I would take the fight to them, where they least expected it, and show them that their fortress in the sky was not beyond the reach of those they sought to crush. The problem was getting there. The floating cities were designed to be impregnable, suspended far above the poisoned surface, connected to the ground only by heavily guarded docking stations and transport hubs. Each city was a self-contained ecosystem, with every luxury and convenience the elite could desire, isolated from the misery of the surface. There were no direct routes from the surface to the cities. Only authorized personnel and supplies were transported, all under the watchful eye of the Empire's security forces. But I had learned to navigate the shadows, to find the cracks in their perfect system. I moved through the night, my destination clear, the transport hub on the outskirts of a nearby settlement. This hub was where goods and personnel were ferried between the surface and the floating cities above. It was one of the few places where the two worlds intersected, albeit briefly, before the elites retreated back to their elevated sanctuaries. As I approached the hub, I stayed low, using the uneven terrain and the cover of darkness to avoid detection. The perimeter was surrounded by tall fences, topped with razor wire, and patrolled by guards with advanced weaponry. Drones buzzed overhead, their sensors sweeping the area for any signs of intruders. But I knew how to avoid them. I had spent my entire life evading the eyes of those who sought to control me. I reached the fence and crouched in the shadows, watching the patrols, timing their movements. The transport ships were housed in a large hangar at the center of the hub, vessels designed for rapid travel between the surface and the cities above. I needed to get inside one of those ships, to stow away and reach Stratos undetected. I waited for the right moment, then struck. The guards never saw me coming. I moved like a shadow, my power crackling just beneath the surface, a force waiting to be released. I took out the first guard with a swift strike to the throat, silencing him before he could raise the alarm. The second guard fell just as quickly, his body crumpling to the ground as I swept through the perimeter. I slipped through the fence, making my way towards the hangar. Workers moved about, loading supplies and preparing for the next departure, unaware of the intruder in their midst. I stayed out of sight, avoiding the cameras, the drones, the watchful eyes of the overseers. I found an unattended cargo bay, the hatch open as crates were being loaded. It was a tight fit, but I squeezed inside, wedging myself between the crates, hidden from view. The hatch closed behind me, sealing me inside the ship. The ship's engines roared to life, the vibration coursing through the hull as it lifted off the ground. I felt the sensation of weightlessness as the ship ascended, the force of gravity lessening as we left the surface behind. I could feel the power of Stratos drawing closer. I would be there soon, and when I arrived, the city would fall. The ship docked with a soft jolt, the cargo bay filling with light as the hatch opened. I waited, listening to the sounds of workers unloading the crates, their voices muffled by the walls of my hiding place. When the noise subsided, I made my move, slipping out of the cargo bay and into the heart of Stratos. The floating city of Stratos, a symbol of extravagance and refinement. Its gleaming towers pierced the clouds, bathed in the soft glow of sunlight that never reached the surface below. This was the seat of the biotech consortium's power, the place where decisions were made, lives were traded, and fates were sealed. It was a world away from the hellscape of Scorvia's surface, a world that had thrived on the suffering of people like me. From the outside, Stratos was a symbol of the Empire's might. It floated effortlessly, suspended by gravity-defying technology that was too complex for the average citizen. The city's surface was a vibrant blend of pristine parks, shimmering lakes, and streets lined with trees that bore fruit untouched by pollution. The people who lived here, the elites, were as carefully cultivated as the flora around them, genetically perfect, designed to enjoy the finest pleasures life had to offer without a thought for the cost to those below. But beneath that perfect veneer was a core of rot. A rot that I intended to expose and obliterate. I slipped through the city's defenses, using the power that had become as much a part of me as my own flesh. The air here was clean, too clean. Completely different from the toxic winds that had always been my constant companion. I could smell the flowers, taste the sweetness of the air, but it only fueled my anger. This was a world built on the bones of the dead, and I would see it burn. I moved through the streets unnoticed, a shadow among the perfect citizens who strolled leisurely, oblivious to the storm about to break over their heads. They laughed, their faces unmarked by hardship, their bodies sculpted by the same technology that had twisted mine. They dined in open-air cafes, their tables laden with food that had been grown in the poisoned fields of Scorvia, tended by the hands of those who would never taste such luxury. They sipped wine that had been purified and perfected, their conversations light and meaningless. As I made my way deeper into the city, the contrast between their lives and mine became more evident and disturbing. Here, in the center of the floating metropolis, the streets were lined with boutiques, selling clothes made from materials that would have been alien to me just days before. The buildings were a blend of glass and steel, shimmering in the artificial light, their facades decorated with art that celebrated the Empire's supposed benevolence. But I wasn't here to gawk at their decadence. I was here for one purpose: to tear down the biotech consortium and leave nothing but ashes in my wake. I reached the central tower, where the consortium's leaders gathered to plot and scheme. The tower rose higher than any other, a spear of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. The entrance was guarded by a phalanx of enhanced soldiers, their bodies encased in black armor, their eyes hidden behind visors that scanned for any threat. I stepped into the open, my hands charged with energy. The soldiers reacted, raising their weapons, but I was faster. I released a wave of power that slammed into them like a freight train, sending their bodies crashing into the walls with bone-shattering force. The ground shook, the pavement cracking as I poured everything I had into the attack. The soldiers didn't stand a chance. Their armor crumpled, their weapons shattered, and within seconds the entrance was littered with their broken bodies. I didn't pause to catch my breath. I was beyond that now. The power was a roaring inferno inside me, and I was its master. I pushed through the shattered doors, my steps leaving scorch marks on the pristine floors. The tower's interior was as opulent as the city outside. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with priceless art. But all of it meant nothing. It was just more evidence of the excess that had fueled the Empire's cruelty. I ascended the tower. More soldiers came pouring out of side corridors, their weapons blazing. I cut them down without hesitation, slicing through them like a hot knife through butter. Their screams echoed through the halls, but I didn't care. They were just more tools of the Empire, and they had chosen their side. As I reached the upper levels, the resistance grew fiercer. Automated defenses sprang to life, turrets descended from the ceiling, drones buzzed around me, their lasers cutting through the air. But I was unstoppable. I tore the turrets from their mounts with a flick of my wrist, sent the drones crashing to the floor in flames. The tower trembled with the force of my assault, the walls cracking, the floor buckling under the strain. And then I was at the door to the consortium's chamber, the final barrier between me and the people who had tried to control me, who had thought they could use me as their puppet. The door was reinforced, nearly impenetrable. But it didn't matter. I placed my hands against the metal and ripped it apart, the door crumpling like paper before me. The chamber beyond was immense, its walls lined with screens displaying data, maps, and images of the galaxy. The leaders of the biotech consortium stood at the far end, their faces calm, unafraid. They were dressed in the finest clothes, their features smooth and unblemished, the epitome of the Empire's genetic perfection. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that their plans had unraveled, that their carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around them. I didn't give them a chance to speak. With a roar, I released everything I had. A tidal wave of power that swept across the chamber, tearing through the screens, the walls, the very foundation of the tower. The leaders were thrown back, their bodies crumpling under the force, their perfect forms reduced to nothing but broken flesh. But I didn't stop. The power surged through me, an unstoppable force that demanded destruction. The walls buckled, the ceiling cracked, and the tower began to collapse. The floor tilted beneath me, but I stood firm, my eyes locked on the dying leaders of the consortium. The tower was falling, and with it, the city would soon follow. The collapse would be catastrophic, the destruction absolute. The elites who had lived in luxury, who had never known hunger or pain, would feel the wrath of the very people they had sought to control. I made my way to the shattered windows, the city below a swirl of lights and chaos. The floating platforms that held Stratos aloft were buckling, the delicate balance that had kept it suspended in the sky destroyed by the collapse of the central tower. The perfect citizens now nothing but panicked figures scrambling for safety. But there would be no safety, not for them. I stood at the edge of the tower, the wind whipping around me, carrying the distant sounds of destruction. The city was falling, and with it, the Empire's grip on this world. The people who had suffered below, who had toiled in the dirt and the poison, would finally see the day when their oppressors paid the price for their greed. The tower began to tilt, the ground beneath me giving way. I stepped off the edge, the air rushing past me as I fell, the city collapsing around me. I could feel the power within me waning, my body weakened by the assault I had unleashed. But it didn't matter. I had done what I came to do. As I plummeted toward the surface, I could see the devastation spreading across the city. The floating platforms tilting, crashing into one another, sending wreckage raining down on the world below. The flames rose higher, consuming everything in their path, a cleansing fire that would leave nothing but ashes in its wake. The wind whipped against my face, the roar of the collapsing city growing fainter as the ground rushed up to meet me. My body was broken, my powers drained, and the last vestiges of strength slipping away as I fell. I could see the ground now, the jagged rocks and poisoned earth of the surface, a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as the life I had known. The city of Stratos, the shining jewel of the Empire, was gone, and with it, the biotech consortium's stranglehold on the world. As the ground drew closer, I thought of those who had suffered, those who had died in the mines and fields, their lives crushed under the weight of the Empire's greed. I had wanted to avenge them, to free them from the chains that had bound them for so long. But in the end, I had only added to the destruction, another casualty in a world that knew only cruelty. The wind howled in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the burning city above. I closed my eyes, the last of my strength fading, and let go. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hold on to. The ground was seconds away now, the end inevitable. And then, with a final shattering impact, I hit the surface. For a moment there was nothing, no pain, no sound, no thought, just darkness, cold and empty, a void that swallowed me whole. Slowly the darkness faded, replaced by the harsh reality of the world I had known all my life. The toxic air of Scorvia filled my lungs one last time, the taste of sulfur on my tongue. The ground beneath me was hard, unyielding, the rocks pressing into my broken body. I lay there, unable to move, unable to breathe, the fire of the city burning out above me, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. There would be no victory, no triumph. The Empire was broken, the biotech consortium destroyed, but I would not live to see the world that would rise from the ashes. I was just one more casualty in a war that had taken too many lives. As the last of my strength faded, I thought of the people I had tried to save, the lives I had fought for. Perhaps in the end, they would be free. Perhaps the world would change, and those who had suffered would finally find peace. But it wouldn't be my world, My fight was over. And as the darkness finally closed in, I let go of the last breath in my lungs and the world faded away.